This is a true story from my life, something that took me years to be able to speak about. It just goes to show you that the person sleeping next to you can be a stranger. You've known for 40 years the man I'd loved for most of my life was about to be utterly ruined by a single sheet of paper, and I was the one who sent it. He stood there on the stage, bathed in the warm golden light of the ballroom at the Mills House Hotel, looking every bit the triumphant king. He handed me the microphone, his eyes twinkling, with what everyone in that room saw as adoration. But what I now knew was the deepest form of contempt. As the process server, a grim man in a cheap suit, stepped through the grand double doors, I knew Richard's world, the one he'd so carefully built on my back, was about to burn to the ground. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is. Right now, it's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. Our story began, as so many do, in a way that felt like fate. It was 1984. I was 24, working as a junior archivist at the Charleston Library Society, spending my days surrounded by the ghosts of Southern history. Richard Thorne was 30, a charismatic and impossibly handsome financial advisor who had just moved from New York to make his mark. He walked into the library one sweltering July afternoon, not looking for books, but for a quiet place to escape the heat and review some documents. He said my focused silence was the most captivating thing he'd ever seen. He was a master of the perfect line, even then. We had dinner that night at a little place called Poogan's Porch, and by the time the bread pudding arrived, I felt like I had known him my entire life. He spoke of ambition, of building a legacy, of wanting a partner who was his equal in mind and spirit. He made me feel seen, intelligent, and cherished. For 40 years we built that life we never legally married. In the beginning it was a romantic bohemian notion. We were partners, not property. A piece of paper doesn't define us. Eleanor, he'd say, squeezing my hand. Our commitment does. As the years went by, it just became a fact of our lives. We were Richard and Eleanor. We filed taxes as individuals, but shared everything. We bought a beautiful, historic home, south of Broad, a classic Charleston single house with a piazza that caught the salty breeze off the harbor. We hosted parties, contributed to local charities, and built a reputation as one of the city's most enduring devoted couples. He was the financial wizard, the extrovert who charmed clients and friends alike. I was his quiet, steady anchor, the one who managed our home, our social calendar, and I thought our shared future. He handled all the finances. It was his domain, his expertise. You handle the art of living, my love, he'd tell me, and I'll handle the boring numbers that make it possible. I trusted him implicitly. Why wouldn't I? Every month he'd sit down with me, showing me spreadsheets and portfolio statements that charted the steady upward climb of our net worth. We had retirement accounts, investment properties, a robust stock portfolio. We were set. Our plan was to retire together at 65. He would step back from his firm, and we would finally travel the world. The Greek Isles, the coast of Italy, the ancient temples of Japan. It was the promise that sweetened the final decade of our working lives. That shared dream was the engine of my entire world. The first crack in that world appeared on a rainy Tuesday in February, the year I turned 64. Richard was in a meeting, and I was gathering our documents for our accountant. It was a ritual he'd performed for decades, collecting the various 1099s and investment summaries and putting them in a neat folder. This time, a statement from our primary brokerage account caught my eye. It was thicker than usual, I paged through it, my eyes scanning the familiar columns of numbers, and then I saw it a wire transfer for $50,000, made the previous October. The recipient was listed simply as IV Holdings, LLC. I didn't recognize the name. Beneath it, the memo line read, consulting fee. I frowned Richard and I discussed every major expense. A $50,000 consulting fee was not something we would have overlooked. I waited for him to come home, the statement lying on the mahogany desk in his study like a silent accusation. When he walked in, tossing his briefcase onto a chair, I held it up. Richard, what's this? I for V Holdings. I don't remember this. He glanced at it, not a flicker of concern on his face. He laughed a deep, dismissive chuckle. Oh, that is a boutique real estate consultancy. They advised me on the tax implications of rezoning the commercial property on King Street. Saved us a fortune in the long run, Ellie. It's just business. He kissed the top of my head and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there. His answer was so smooth, so plausible. And yet, a cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. He had never in 40 years made a financial move of that size without drawing up a plan with me first, usually over a bottle of wine and a long dinner. This was different. It felt hidden. I told myself I was being foolish, that I was letting a lifetime of trust be eroded by a single line item on a brokerage statement. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was a tiny splinter of doubt, lodged deep in my heart, and it began to fester. A few days later, unable to shake the feeling, I sat down at his computer. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt like a spy in my own home. Richard was out playing golf, his Saturday morning ritual. I didn't even know his password, but I tried. The first thing that came to mind, the name of the sailboat Wed owned in the 90s. The Eleanor. The screen unlocked. For a moment, I just sat there frozen with guilt and fear. What was I even looking for? I navigated to the banking website, my hands trembling as I typed. I found the transaction history and searched for IRV Holdings. There wasn't just one payment. There were dozens stretching back, years, small ones. At first, then larger and larger amounts, consulting fees, investment transfers, capital outlays. It totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars, a slow, methodical bleeding of the future we had built together. It was a secret financial world running parallel to ours, and I had never known. The room began to feel cold, the walls closing in. This wasn't a simple oversight. This was a deliberate long-term deception. And as I scrolled deeper and deeper into the digital abyss of our accounts, I realized with chilling certainty that the man I had given my life to was methodically robbing me blind. The initial shock was paralyzing. I sat there for what felt like hours, the glow of the monitor illuminating the tears streaming down my face. My first instinct was denial. There had to be an explanation. A secret project, a surprise for me, but the sheer volume of transactions and the calculated way they were disguised under vague business terms screamed otherwise. This was no surprise. This was a system. Richard came home that afternoon, whistling, his face flushed from the sun and the camaraderie of the 18th hole. I closed the laptop and met him in the foyer, my face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. I couldn't confront him. Not yet. I had no leverage, no understanding of what I was truly up against. Confrontation would only make him lock down the information, and some primal instinct told me that information was the only power I had left. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell. I lived with a stranger who looked and sounded exactly like the love of my life. I'd watch him across the dinner table as he talked about his day. his hand resting warmly on mine, and a wave of nausea would wash over me. Every touch felt like a lie, every smile a betrayal. I started my own investigation, a clandestine operation conducted in the dead of night. I became a student of our own life, searching for the truth hidden in plain sight. I was clumsy at first. My generation hadn't grown up with the internet as a second language. I spent hours on Google typing in basic questions. How to search public records, find information on an LLC, South Carolina Business Registry. My first breakthrough came from the South Carolina Secretary of State's website. I found the registration documents for IV Holdings LLC. It was a shell company registered to a post office box at a UPS store in Mount Pleasant, just across the Ravenel Bridge. There were no officers listed, only a registered agenta, generic legal service used for anonymity. It was a dead end, but it was also a breadcrumb. A P.O. box in Mount Pleasant. Why, there we lived downtown. Our accountant was on Daniel Island. Our lawyers were on Broad Street. There was no logical reason for Richard to conduct business out of a suburban strip mall. I started digging into the other transfers. Many were labeled property management fees. This was my next thread. I began searching Charleston County's public property record online. A tedious process of cross-referencing names and dates. I searched for Richard's name, our address, anything I could think of. Nothing. Then on a whim, I tried searching for the LLC itself. I typed IV Holdings into the owner search field. Bingo, a single result popped up. IV Holdings LLC was the owner of a property, a stunning modern beachfront house on Isle of Palms. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. I clicked on the details. The property had been purchased 5 years prior for $28 million cash. Our cash, my cash. I looked at the photos in the online listing, a sprawling deck, a private pool, floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of the Atlantic. It was a house I had never seen, a life I had never known, bought with the money I had helped earn and save. The mailing address for the property tax bill was listed not as the house itself, but as the same UPS store P.O. box in Mount Pleasant. I had to see it. The following Saturday, while Richard was at his golf game, I drove my car over the bridge to Isle of Palms. It was a brilliant sunny day, the kind that usually filled me with joy. Today, the clear sky felt like a mockery. I found the address on a quiet, exclusive street, lined with palatial vacation homes. And there it was. It was even more beautiful in person. Perfectly manicured lawn, glistening pool, the sound of the ocean just beyond the dunes. A new slate gray BMW was parked in the driveway. It wasn't Richard's car, as I sat there parked across the street, trying to be inconspicuous in my old Volvo. The front door opened. A woman emerged. She was younger than me, maybe in her early 50s, stylishly dressed in crisp white linen. She was elegant, confident. And then the door opened again, and Richard stepped out behind her. He wasn't wearing his golf attire. He was dressed in casual weekend clothes. He smiled, put his arm around her waist, and kissed her on the cheek. They stood there for a moment, looking out at the ocean together, the very picture of domestic bliss. It was a scene from a life that should have been mine. The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't just about money. The letters IV from the LLC suddenly clicked into place in my mind with a sickening finality. They weren't random initials. I drove away in a daze, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. That night I hired a private investigator. I found him online. A man named Frank Ballard, a former Charleston PD detective who specialized in sensitive domestic matters. His office was a small, nondescript suite in a building in West Ashley. It smelled of stale coffee and regret. Frank was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with tired eyes that had seen everything. He didn't judge, he just listened. I told him the whole story, my voice breaking as I laid out the financial discrepancies and the scene I had witnessed at the beach house. I gave him the P.O. box number and the address on Isle of Palms. I paid him his retainer with a cashier's check drawn from a small savings account I had in my own name, a rainy day fund my mother had insisted I keep 30 years ago. It felt like the storm she had warned me about had finally arrived. Frank called me 2 weeks later. "I have something for you," he said, his voice flat. "I think you should come see it in person." I met him back at his office. He slid a thick manila envelope across the desk towards me. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Richard and the woman whose name Frank informed me was Isabella Vance shopping, together on King Street, having lunch at Fig Walking Hand, in hand on the beach. There were photos of them at a charity gala I had been too ill to attend last spring. He was looking at her with the same loving expression he had given me for 40 years. It was a performance, and he was playing the lead role in 2 separate shows. But the last document in the envelope was the one that shattered me completely. It was a high-quality copy of a marriage certificate from the state of Nevada, Richard Thorne and Isabella Vance, married in Las Vegas. 35 years ago, I stared at the date, unable to process it. He had married her just 5 years after he met me. My entire relationship, my home, my identity as his partner, it was all a sham. He had a wife, a real legal wife, and I was what? His mistress, his long-term roommate. His fool, Frank, cleared his throat, pulling me from my spiral. "There's more," he said gently. "Isabella Vance isn't just his wife. She's the sole officer of Ivesur Holdings. And before that, she was a partner at a boutique accounting firm that specialized in asset management for high-net-worth individuals. She's not just a party to this Ms. Vance, she's the architect." The information landed. Not like a bomb, but like a slow-acting poison, seeping into every memory, every cherished moment of my 40 years with Richard, and corrupting it all. The trips we took, the holidays we shared, the quiet nights we spent reading. By the fire, all of it was tainted, rewritten as a grotesque charade. He hadn't been building a life with me, he had been using me to fund a life with someone else. Isabella wasn't just a secret wife, she was his co-conspirator. Her financial acumen was the weapon, and my trust was the weakness. They had exploited. Together, they were an unstoppable force of quiet, legalistic theft. My first call was to a lawyer, one of the most respected family law attorneys in Charleston, a woman named Sarah Beth Jacobson. Her office in a historic building on Broad Street was the epitome of old Southern power. Dark wood leather-bound books, a faint scent of lemon oil and money. I laid out the whole sordid story, my voice surprisingly steady. I presented Frank's evidence, the photos, the LLC documents, the marriage certificate. I watched her face as she reviewed the documents, her expression shifting from professional sympathy to genuine shock. When she was done, she took off her reading glasses and looked at me with a profound sadness in her eyes that frightened me more than any legal jargon could, Eleanor. She began, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Your situation is extraordinarily difficult." She explained the legal reality in cold, clear terms. In South Carolina, there is no common law marriage if one party is already legally married to someone else. My 40-year relationship with Richard had no legal standing. The home we shared, which I had lovingly restored and cared for, was in his name. Only our joint brokerage account had been systematically drained over the years, with the funds funneled legally into a corporate entity owned by his wife. The cars, the art, the antiques, nearly everything of significant value had been structured to belong to him, and by extension, his legal spouse. He didn't just hide his marriage. Sarah Beth said, her fingers steepled on her polished desk. He used his expertise as a financial planner and her expertise as an accountant to create a perfectly legal firewall. He structured your entire life together to be a terminable partnership where you held no equity. From a legal standpoint, you are entitled to almost nothing. Almost nothing. The words echoed in the silent, ornate office. 40 years of love, of partnership, of sacrifice, reduced to nothing by a legal framework he had expertly manipulated. I thought about the inheritance I'd received from my parents, a substantial sum that I'd handed over to Richard to invest for our future. It was gone, absorbed into the machine. I thought of the career opportunities I'd passed up to support his managing our home and social life, so he could focus on his ascent. All of it counted for nothing. The villain I was facing wasn't just a cheat. He was a genius of bureaucratic cruelty. He hadn't broken the law in a way that was easy to prove. He had simply used it, bent it, and sharpened it into a weapon to bleed me dry over decades. He was utterly, completely untouchable. I walked out of that law office into the humid Charleston air, feeling like a ghost. I was financially and emotionally obliterated. That evening, Richard came home, and the performance continued. He asked about my day, feigned interest in the book I was reading, and suggested we open a special bottle of wine to celebrate us. I played along a hollow shell of myself. The rage and despair inside me were so immense, I was afraid they would leak out of my eyes. How could he do this? How could he sit there looking at me with such feigned affection, knowing he had a whole other life, a whole other wife, and that he had been systematically erasing me from our shared history? The next few weeks were the darkest of my life. I saw my future spooling out before me, a lonely, impoverished old age cast aside after a lifetime of devotion. Richard, meanwhile, was at the zenith of his power and prestige. His 65th birthday was approaching, and with it, his retirement. He was being celebrated by his firm, lauded in the local business journal. He was a pillar of the community, a man known for his integrity and financial acumen. He was untouchable, arrogant, and invincible. He had all the money, all the power, and all the legal protection. I had nothing but the crushing weight of his betrayal. The villain wasn't just winning. He had already won. He had been playing a game I never even knew existed. And he had checkmated me 35 years ago in a chapel in Las Vegas. Every day I spent in that house, surrounded by the beautiful objects that were not mine, with the man who was not mine, felt like I was suffocating. I knew I couldn't survive it. Something had to break. Either I would break or he would. The thought of him retiring into a golden sunset, with Isabella on a beach I had paid for, was a fate worse than death. The helplessness was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself in the attic going through old boxes. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a connection to a time when my life felt real. I found a box of old letters we had written to each other during the first few years of our relationship. Back when he had to travel frequently for work, I sat there on the dusty floor, and read them the elegant loops of his handwriting, a painful reminder of the man I thought I knew. And then I found it. A letter from 1986, a year after he had secretly married Isabella. It was filled with passionate declarations and promises. I read one line and the air left my lungs. I can wait to make you my wife and build our entire world together. He had written everything. Idaho, every dollar I make is for you, for us. The hypocrisy was so profound, so utterly monstrous, that it snapped something inside me. The grief, the despair, the helplessness. It all burned away, cauterized by a sudden white-hot fury. The tears stopped. My hands stopped shaking. A cold, clear purpose settled over me. He had used the law to destroy me. Fine Sarah Beth had said I had almost no legal standing in family court. But this wasn't just a domestic dispute anymore. This was fraud. He hadn't just been my partner. He had presented himself as my trusted financial advisor. He had a fiduciary duty to me, and he had used that position of trust to systematically defraud me for decades. He had built his world, but he had done it with my money, my inheritance, my life. I wouldn't be his victim. I would be his reckoning. I stood up the letter, clutched in my hand, my mind already racing. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he had won. He had no idea what a woman with nothing left to lose was capable of. The decision to fight back wasn't a single moment of explosive revelation, but a slow, cold dawn. The grief didn't vanish, but it crystallized into something harder, something useful resolve. I realized that Richard's greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability, his reputation. He had spent 40 years curating the image of Richard Thorne, the brilliant, trustworthy financial guru, the charming community benefactor, the devoted partner. His entire world was built on that facade. If I couldn't get my money back through family court, I would destroy the man himself and see what assets shook loose from the wreckage I called Sarah Beth Jacobson. The next morning, I have an idea, I said, my voice devoid of the quavering emotion from our last meeting. You said, I have no standing as a spouse. But what about as an investor? A client. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Tell me more, she said, a new note of interest in her voice. I laid it out for her for 40 years. Richard had managed every penny I had, including my substantial inheritance. He had presented himself as my financial advisor. He had signed documents as such. He had a fiduciary responsibility to act in my best interest. Instead, he had engaged in a decades-long scheme of fraudulent conveyance, moving my assets into his wife's control under the guise of investments and consulting fees. It was a long shot, a complex and unconventional angle. But it was an angle, it's a high-stakes, difficult case to prove. Sarah Beth warned, hell argue. The money was a gift, part of your domestic partnership. His lawyers will be brutal. They'll paint you as a scorned lover, delusional and vindictive. I am vindictive, I replied calmly. And I have the truth. Let's get a forensic accountant. The next phase of my life began publicly. I was the same Eleanor. I played the part of the devoted, slightly doddering partner, perhaps a little more subdued than usual, which Richard attributed to sadness about our approaching empty nest years of retirement. I feigned ignorance about our finances, asking him to explain the complicated parts to me again, watching him preen with condescending patience. Every word of his was a lie, and every lie was a nail I would use for his coffin. Privately, my life was a whirlwind of covert activity. I met with Sarah Beth and a forensic accountant named Marcusa, quiet, hawk-eyed man who could find the narrative in a spreadsheet. I paid him from what was left of my mother's secret fund. Marcus dove into the digital records I had copied from Richard's computer. He worked miracles following the money trail through a labyrinth of shell corporations and trusts, unearthing the systematic transfer of my wealth into Isabella's control. He found the original source of the funds for the Isle of Palms, house my inheritance liquidated from a trust my father had left me, moved through 3 different accounts before being used for the cash purchase. It was the smoking gun. While Marcus built the financial case, I focused on building the emotional one. Richard's 65th birthday was in 3 months. He wanted a party. Not just a party, but an eventer. Grand celebration of his life and career. A final victory lap before he retired. It should be at the Mills house, he declared one night, the grand ballroom. Well, invite everyone, Ellie. All our friends, my most important clients, the partners from the firm. It will be a night to remember. An evil, brilliant idea began to form in my mind. Oh, Richard, that's a wonderful idea, I said, my voice full of manufactured enthusiasm, a tribute to everything you've built. You deserve it. Let me plan it for you. It will be my gift. He was delighted, flattered by my devotion. He handed over the reins, completely trusting me to organize the perfect coronation for King Richard. And so I became the meticulous planner of his downfall. I booked the ballroom. I hired the caterers and the string quartet. I worked with a graphic designer to create the most elegant invitations embossed with Richard's monogram. I personally called every single person on the guest list, over 200 of them, to ensure they would be there to celebrate Richard. I made sure his oldest clients, the ones whose families had trusted him for generations, were seated at the front tables. I made sure the managing partners of his firm, the men who valued their companies, sterling reputation above all else, were there. I invited the editor of the local business journal and a few key figures from the charitable boards he sat on. I was gathering a jury. During this time, I had Frank, my P. I do one last job for me. I wanted to know about Isabella. I discovered she wasn't just a co-conspirator. She was a predator in her own right. She had a history of attaching herself to wealthy older men. She had met Richard at a financial conference in Atlanta when he was there on business. He had told me it was a boring seminar he had to attend alone. They had begun their affair. Then, and a year later, they were married. She had seen him for what he was, a charming narcissist with a trusting, financially comfortable partner he was willing to fleece. She didn't just agree to the plan, she likely designed it. This knowledge hardened my heart against any lingering feelings of pity. They were 2 sides of the same corrupt coin. The day before the party, Sarah Beth filed the lawsuit. A massive multi-count complaint for fraud, unjust enrichment, breach of fiduciary duty, and constructive trust. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression, meticulously documented with Marcus's forensic findings. We timed it so it wouldn't be served until the next evening, at the precise moment I designated. The plan was a symphony of destruction, and every piece was perfectly in place. The night of the party arrived, I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom, adjusting the pearls around my neck. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress. I looked calm, composed. Richard came up behind me, handsome in his tuxedo. He wrapped his arms around my waist. "You look beautiful, Ellie," he whispered, kissing my neck. "Tonight is for us, the start of our next chapter." I met his eyes in the mirror, a faint cold smile on my lips. "Yes, it is," I said. In my small evening bag, nestled next to my lipstick, was a small, innocent-looking flash drive. It contained the slideshow from hell. My heart wasn't pounding with fear. but with the steady rhythmic beat of a drum of war. The grand ballroom of the Mills House Hotel was a sea of glittering chandeliers, clinking champagne glasses, and the low hum of influential conversation. 200 of Charleston's finest had turned out to honor Richard Thorne. He moved through the crowd like a conquering hero, accepting handshakes and backpats, his arm possessively around my waist. He introduced me, as he always did. My better half, my rock, the incredible Eleanor. Tonight the words felt like acid. I smiled, played my part, and watched the clock. I spotted Isabella across the room. She was even more striking in person, dressed in a shimmering silver gown, holding court near the bar. She was listed on the guest list as Isabella Vance, a family friend and business associate. She caught my eye for a fleeting second, a flicker of what looked like smug pity in her expression before turning back to her conversation. The arrogance was breathtaking. They were so confident, so utterly sure of their victory, that she had dared to attend his coronation. The dinner was lavish, the wine flowed freely. Then came the speeches. His business partner spoke of Richard's unimpeachable integrity. A wealthy client, a man whose family had known Richard for 30 years, called him more than an advisor, a true friend. Each tribute was another layer of irony on an already grotesque cake. Richard sat beside me, soaking it all in his face, a mask of humble gratitude. He squeezed my hand under the table. "They're all so kind," he murmured. "It's because they know the real you," I replied, my voice sweet as poison. Finally, it was his turn. He took the stage to thunderous applause, giving a masterful speech, full of charm and feigned humility. He thanked his partners, his clients, and his friends. Then he turned his gaze to me, but none of this he said. His voice, thick with emotion, would have been possible without the love, support, and wisdom of my partner, of 40 years, Eleanor. She is the heart of my life. And now I want to bring her up to say a few words as we prepare to start our retirement together. He gestured for me to join him on stage. The applause swelled. This was it, the moment I had been planning for months. I walked to the stage, my legs steady, and took the microphone from his hand. I gave him a soft smile. He smiled back completely, unsuspecting. "Thank you, Richard." I began, my voice clear and strong, amplified throughout the silent ballroom. "You're right. It has been an incredible 40 years. A journey filled with so many surprises." I glanced over at the tech booth at the back of the room, where a young man I'd hired was waiting for my signal. I gave a slight nod. Richard has always been a master of planning for the future. I continued, turning my attention back to the crowd. He believes in diversifying assets, in protecting what's most important. And tonight I want to share with you all the incredible secret portfolio he's been building for the last 35 years. On the massive screen behind me, where a lovely photo of Richard and me had been displayed moments before a new image appeared. It was a crisp, clear scan of a Nevada marriage certificate, dated August 12th, 1989. The names were stark against the official letterhead, Richard Thorne and Isabella Vance. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Phones began to rise, their cameras pointed at the stage. Richard froze beside me, his smile vaporizing. His face went white. "Eleanor, what is this?" he hissed, grabbing for my arm. I stepped away from him. "This," I said, my voice ringing with newfound power, "is Richard's wife, Isabella. Would you care to stand?" I looked directly at her table. All heads swiveled in her direction. She looked like a trapped animal, her face a mask of pure panic. The next slide appeared. It was a flowchart created by my forensic accountant, Marcus. It showed the liquidation of my father's trust arrows, depicted the money flowing from my inheritance into a holding account, and then directly to the purchase of the 28 million beachfront property on Isle of Palms. The next slide was the property deed in the name of IV Holdings, LLC. Richard and I never had a house at the beach. I explained calmly to the stunned audience, but Richard and Isabella do. It's a beautiful home. I paid for it, but I've never been invited inside. Slide after slide, I laid bare their entire scheme. Bank statements showing the consulting fees, corporate registration documents for IV Holdings listing, Isabella as the sole officer, photographs of their life together, the secret vacations, the intimate moments, all funded by the money he stole from me. I narrated the entire 40-year lie, not with anger, but with the cold, precise clarity of a historian presenting facts. The room was utterly silent, save for the clicks of my presentation remote and the frantic whispers that were beginning to erupt. Richard stood beside me, paralyzed, his reputation dissolving in real time under the hot glare of the stage lights. As I showed the final slide, a picture of the two of them arms linked, wearing wedding rings I'd never seen, the grand ballroom doors opened. The process server I had hired, the same grim man from my recurring nightmare, walked confidently down the center aisle. He walked directly up to the stage and extended a thick legal envelope to Richard. Richard Thorne, the man said, his voice booming in the silent room. "You've been served." Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. The flash of cameras was now incessant. Isabella was trying to flee her table, but she was hemmed in by the crowd of gawking, judging faces. It was over. His kingdom had crumbled. I turned to Richard one last time. The man I saw was no longer a king. He was just a small, terrified fraud. I leaned into the microphone. "Happy birthday, Richard," I said. Then I set the microphone down on the podium, walked off the stage, and never looked back. The aftermath was exactly what I had designed it to be, swift, total, and catastrophic for Richard. The story was irresistible. The salacious details of the public takedown at his own 65th birthday gala spread through Charleston's social and business circles like a wildfire. By the next morning, it was the only thing anyone was talking about. His name, once a symbol of integrity, was now synonymous with deceit and scandal. His firm, terrified of the reputational damage, immediately placed him on an indefinite leave of absence and issued a public statement disavowing his actions. The managing partners, who had toasted his genius just hours before, were now scrambling to reassure clients that their money was safe. His most important clients, the ones I had made sure were sitting front and center for my presentation, left him in droves. The trust he had spent a lifetime building was annihilated in a single evening. The lawsuit was brutal. Richard and Isabella's high-priced legal team initially came out swinging, trying to paint me as an unstable, vengeful woman. But they couldn't argue with the mountain of evidence Marcus had compiled. The paper trail was irrefutable. My lawsuit wasn't just about a broken heart. It was about calculated long-term financial fraud. Faced with the evidence and the unrelenting public pressure, they knew a trial would be a disaster for them, likely opening them up to criminal investigation by the IRS and the SEC. 6 months after that fateful night, they agreed to a settlement. It wasn't everything I had lost over 40 years. You can never truly reclaim stolen time. But it was substantial. I received a significant portion of the value of our shared assets, including a lump sum that represented my stolen inheritance with interest. The house south of Broad was sold, as was the beach house on Isle of Palms. Their empire built on my life was liquidated to pay me off. I never saw Richard again. After that night, I heard through the grapevine that he and Isabella left Charleston retreating into a disgraced obscurity somewhere in Florida. Their perfect life, their grand plan had been reduced to ashes. For me, the victory wasn't in the money, though it gave me security and independence. The true victory was in the reclamation of my own story. I was no longer the tragic victim, the deluded fool. I was the woman who had fought back, the architect of my own justice. I didn't rebuild my old life. That life was a fiction. I built a new one. I bought a small, charming cottage in the old village of Mount Pleasant, a quiet place with a garden and a view of the harbor. It was entirely mine, bought with my own money. In my own name, I started traveling. Not with a partner, but with my own curiosity. As my guide, I went to the Greek Isles. I walked the Amalfi Coast. I saw the temples in Japan. I did everything we had once dreamed of, but I did it for myself. My life became smaller, quieter, and infinitely more authentic. The rage has long since faded, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. I don't waste my time thinking about Richard anymore. He is a ghost from a life that no longer belongs to me. Sometimes on a quiet evening, when the salt air drifts in through my open windows, I think about the nature of trust and betrayal, and how fine a line there is between them. He thought his meticulous planning and legal firewalls made him invincible. He underestimated the one thing he could never control. He didn't just steal my money, he stole my past, but the one thing a thief can never take is the truth. And in the end, the truth was the only weapon I needed. The end.